Everybody, thanks for joining us in person and online for yet another week of our Mark study. We are doing something a little strange this week. On this last Sunday, we did Mark 12, 1 through 12. But this week, we're going to go backwards in time, and we're going to do Mark 11. We, in our Sunday services, are going to be focusing a little bit more on the radical teachings of Jesus in this last week, which means we'll be spending a lot of time on very short amount of verses in Mark 12 in the coming weeks on Sundays. But we are going to use these Wednesdays, as we always have, to fill in the details in between. There just might be a little jump forward, jump backwards. So, for instance, next week we will be dealing with the entirety of chapter 12, but it's just the stuff in between. And then this week we are, as I said, looking at Mark 11. We'll be looking at the entire chapter. And so that it seems like a lot, but it's not actually one of the terribly long chapters. So let's go ahead and turn there in a second. And then let's actually just begin in prayer today. Let's pray. God, guide us as we begin to encounter this final week of Jesus's ministry and life. We are excited to see what we can learn, how this experience can be deeper, how our conception of the events and who Jesus is can widen, and our faith can become more. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so Mark 11, 1 through 11, just the brief contextual note. Immediately preceding this, at the tail end of chapter 10, we're dealing with Jesus is coming up from Jericho. We talked about the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, I believe, in our study last week. He's made that journey. They are staying at Bethpage in Bethany, which is on the backside of the Mount of Olives. So he's not made it all the way to Jerusalem. He is going up. He's gone up the Judean mountains from Jericho, the lowest city in the world, up to Jerusalem, up on Mount Moriah. And but he's not made it all the way, just made it to Bethany and Bethpage, where we are led to infirm from evidence both in scripture and other traditions that would be a seat of many of the followers of Jesus, particularly some of the wealthy ones. And so it makes sense that he would be staying there. That also makes sense just in general because he's going there for Passover, and there would have been an enormous amount of people traveling Jerusalem because this would have been one of the three main pilgrimage festivals. And so he, along with many other people, were probably staying in Bethpage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives. So if we would we have a volunteer to read for us Mark 11, 1 through 11 that has it available here. I'm going to hand you this microphone that I have mounted to a fork.
Oh, it's fork away. There you go.
So we're going to be reading Mark 11, 1 through 11, and it appears you're reading the NT Wright one, which is going to reflect no one's translation, but you can follow along because it's NT Wright's own translation. It's going to be close enough, but it's going to work. So go ahead, Bob.
So they approached Jerusalem. They got as far as Bethpage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives when Jesus sent two of his disciples on ahead with a specific task. Go to the village over there, he said to them, and as soon as you enter it, you will find a colt tied up, one that nobody has ever ridden before. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone says to you, why are you doing that? Then say, the master needs it, and he will return it at once. They went off and found the colt tied up beside a door out on the street, and they untied it. Some of the bystanders said to them, why are you untying the colt? They gave the answer Jesus had told them and let them carry on. So they brought the colt to Jesus and laid their cloaks on it, and he mounted it. Several people spread out their cloaks on the road. Others did the same with foliage that they had cut in the fields. Those in front and those coming behind shouted, Hosanna, welcome in the Lord's name. Here comes the kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. Jesus entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, and looked all around. It was already getting late, and he returned to Bethany with the 12.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's so familiar to us that if we just stop and look at it slightly differently, it's a strange story. The donkey part of it aside, the cult part of it aside, Jesus is just going to the temple. We don't even really know for what purpose. People were probably going to the temple to make their sacrifices or to pay their temple taxes. Jesus just going to the temple, and a parade happens to pop up on his way into there. And then he gets there, looks around at everything, and then leaves. It's almost like he's on a scouting mission for what he's going to turn around and do tomorrow. It is a very strange story. Now, I think as we unpack the symbolism of it, that's the point. The symbolism is the point, because it's Mark telling the story. It's not necessarily Mark is not an omniscient narrator. He does not know what is going on in Jesus's mind as this is happening. So the biggest point of irony, I know this is well worn territory, but this triumphal entry just tends to follow the patterns that you see depicted in other rulers entering cities. There's this sort of well-known, well-established pattern. It's sort of a fourfold pattern. The conqueror, the ruler, first is escorted into the city by the citizenry or the army of the conqueror. That's kind of what's happening here. But instead of an army, Jesus has, peasants, farmers, fishermen, folks like that, women that are following him. The procession is accompanied by hymns and acclamations. Here it's the hymns and acclamations are quotations from Psalm 118. Ironically, we talked about on Sunday, Psalm 118 is quoted later when Jesus is having a confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees. The Roman triumph has shown us that there's very elements of the procession that depict the authority of the ruler. There's the symbols of, such as in Rome, the colors of red. There's the depictions of the military. There's the depictions of the eagle, the various imagery. And so the imagery here Jesus is playing with is a subversion of that. It's not the war horse, it's the colt, it's the lowly animal. And then the entrance is followed by what is called a ritual of appropriation, such as a sacrifice, which takes place in the temple, whereby the ruler symbolically appropriates the city. So an example of this, the most striking historical example of this is when Alexander the Great himself entered the city of Jerusalem. Then all the Jews, this is what we actually have from Josephus describing this. Then all the Jews together greeted Alexander with one voice and surrounded him. And he gave his hand to the high priest, and with the Jews running beside him, he entered the city. Then he went up to the temple where he sacrificed to God under the direction of the high priest. That's one of the examples we have of a triumphal entry, in fact, into Jerusalem itself. So it is meant to demonstrate power. It's meant to show who actually controls things. There is an element of, particularly in that, a bit of a sacrilegious thing, because I doubt Alexander thinks of himself as being under the rule of Israel's God, but he's willing to play the game in order to maybe pacify some people. We have Antony's entrance into Ephesus. When Antony made his entrance into Ephesus, women arrayed like bacchanals and men and boy like satyrs and pans led their way before him, and the city was full of ivory and thyrsus wands and harps and pipes and flutes, the people hailing him as Dionysus, giver of joy and beneficent, for he was such undoubtedly to some. So that's Plutarch just sharing a story. This is a common thing, and yet Jesus is doing this in this sort of dramatic sense of irony. It's a subversion of those expectations. Now, some degree of a parade probably would have happened as Roman rulers during that city wanted to show, if you have this city that's doubling, tripling, quadrupling in size because of all these people coming in for this festival, it stands to reason, and we know this historically, that Roman rulers would have staged displays of power to basically say, have your festival, but let's keep it in check, guys. Because they certainly would have experienced issues with this. And we know this even from later history. When we get to the Jewish revolts, the Passover is sort of a locus of those revolts that happened from 66 that culminate ultimately in 70 with the destruction of the temple. Now, some folks have even gone and pointed out that Mark, remember we talk about Mark, we assume Mark is writing mostly to a Roman audience, and mostly Mark is someone that is not terribly familiar with the area of Judea. He's probably a foreigner. He's not a Jew himself. He's a translator, a slave, a servant of Peter, who's writing down all the things he has heard from Peter. That's the tradition says. But there is an interesting irony here is if he's writing to a Roman audience, they're most likely reading this after the destruction of the temple. And so if they are in Rome in particular, they probably would have had memory of Vespasian, who was the emperor that led the destruction of Jerusalem. And so we actually have a description a little bit of Vespasian when he had his own sort of triumphant entry back into Rome after he had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. So it says he was crowned with laurel. He was clad in the traditional purple robes of the emperor. The Senate and chief magistrates awaited him. This is what Josephus says, it is impossibly adequate to describe the multitude of those spectacles in their magnificence. But he notes that there are rare works of art that were on display in this parade. There were treasures of silver and gold. There were massive moving stages in which the progress of the war was rehearsed to see. Can you imagine that? They were like moving, in many ways afloat, except they don't have easy flatbeds to move things like we do, and yet they were doing it, where they were rehearsing what it was like to conquer Jerusalem, to enjoy the spoils of the war. And it actually says there are copies of the Jewish law that were on display as part of this parade. And so there's sort of like multiple, there's the one level of meaning that Jesus is doing this is a real thing that's happened, and there's that level of meaning where it's Jesus is doing a parody of a ruler's parade. But then there's that other layer of meaning or symbolism where those in Rome would have actually seen the history Jesus predicted play out in front of their eyes, and then also see yet another parade to try to celebrate that. So that's a lot of wild things happening here. Again, remember we're talking the premise of this entire series is Mark's the one who wrote it down first. It doesn't necessarily mean he had the best information, but he wrote it down first, and Luke and Matthew certainly used Mark. They obviously had other sources. Those may have been written sources, or they may have just been a singular oral source. Q, this other source that people use, could have been one person. We don't know. But Mark is the one writing it first. And so sometimes it's interesting to note where Mark's depiction and Matthew and Luke's depiction of these events are subtly different. So one of those would be what people actually put on the road. We call it Palm Sunday, but Mark isn't concerned with palms at all. Notice the language that was used there. I can't remember. Yeah, it said foliage. Let's see what the NRSV says here. Leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. There's some degree of scholarly debate within that, because the word that is being used there, stibatos, it is not an entirely clear term. Some people think it's probably best rendered as tall grass. So if you think about going out in the fields, having been to that area of the world, these are not fields just full of trees. That's not the topography here, especially around Jerusalem, because you're raising an elevation. So, yeah, what is yours say?
It was noticed that word means leaves or leafy branches, which were readily available near fields. Only John, just branches, which apparently came from Jericho. They were not native to Jerusalem.
That's a very good point. So, yeah, so palm branches, if they were present, as John says, they would have come from Jericho, which makes sense because we talked about Jericho and its unique. It's very fertile because it's above the Dead Sea, and I can't remember what it was. There was pomegranate and a couple other things they were well known for. So. I don't know if they would import them or people just happened to have them along their way. It's entirely possible some of the people with Jesus had been planning this along, fans. They could have said, hey, we're going to enact this thing that we see in our prophecy from 2 Kings. Let's bring these things along. There's other references in there. This is idea of putting garments in front. I think Mark is having a little bit of fun there with what just happened with Bartimaeus. If you remember when we talked about Bartimaeus, when he jumps up, it says he throws off his cloak. I think there's an element of that at play. There's also, it talks about in 2 Kings 9, says the people spread their garments on the steps before Jehu, and hail him Jehu as king. So there's things there. The other parallels come from Zechariah with the writing of the cult. All of those things in there, I am most compelled by the interpretation that this whole thing is really portrayed very much as a parody, using real prophecy, real imagery. And so I'm not doubting the historicity of this, but I'm also thinking there is a pretty strong sense of irony being there as Jesus continues to demonstrate he's not the Messiah that people predict him to be over and over. And yet Mark seems to continue to portray people as not understanding it. One final note I would say is we have the crowd cheering there and singing these songs of acclamation. It's difficult for us to understand this first because we understand Jesus as divine and we have a very developed theology of Jesus as Son of God. We have a very developed theology of the Trinity. And so when we read Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest. There's a bit, we may think that they are saying these things to Jesus. These are ascriptions of praise to Jesus. But at this point in the narrative, they just see Jesus as an authorized agent of God, but not God himself. And so these praises that are being raised up are praises for, I don't know, the Titans win the Super Bowl. We're having a parade here, and everyone's like saying, thank God the Titans won. Well, we're not saying any of the Titans players are divine. We're just happy. We're happy in this parade that the Titan players happen to be at. It reminds us of our thanksgiving to God. And so they are giving thanks to God for this agent of God who they don't see as divine at this point, coming to potentially maybe take up the full mantle of the role of Messiah. So they do. Yeah, yes, but yes. I mean, if you want to get really more complicated, the David stuff is really complicated part of it, because to what extent do they understand those titles to be figures or roles? I don't want to get into that, but yes, it is an element that's just not some random elder from a community. There's something in that range of Messiah to prophet, or however you want to create that. It's somewhere in there. So it's definitely an elevated thing. Yep. Who do you say I am? Yep. Yeah, and keep in mind these, the degree of how much they know about him is going to be highly variable, because this is the most diverse crowd Jesus has ever been in, because it's people from all over the kingdom who've gathered here. So you probably have some people that are participating only having known about Jesus for a hot second, whereas you have also people participating in it that have been with Jesus from the beginning. And then you also have people there that are like, what is going on? So, yeah. I mean, I think other gospel renditions of this have elements of, observers having fear, particularly authorities. So he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, it was already late, and he went out to Bethany with the 12. So I want to talk about that a little bit later. I want to make sure I'm looking at my notes in the right places. I have so many notes on these things because it's interesting.
Because don't build a house until you count the cost, and it's checking out something new before he goes there.
All right, who's going to read 12 through 14 for us? Who would do that? Okay, let me hand you the fork microphone. 12 through 14.
The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, He went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it.
All right, so this little story is the beginning of one of the Markan sandwiches. We talked about this before, where Mark bookends stories to either use a middle story to expand the point or just to be rhetorically interesting. Here, I think he's not using the portion in the middle to try to explain the other portions, but I believe this is just another example of being rhetorically interesting. This is a Markan. So the fig tree here, we have this incident with the fig tree, and then we're going to come back and we're going to see something has happened to this fig tree. So, but I will say, and I think it should be a little bit obvious in the reading of it, this is a problematic story, and here's why it's a little problematic. Jesus would know full and well that this fig tree would not have been producing good figs at this time. And so you have to, in your own mind, you sort of have to answer this question. Fig trees in the ancient Near East, and even now, produce their fruit twice a year. Here are the windows for that: May and June. May and June is one of the windows. The other window is August and October. But the time of the Passover would have been March or early April. So any self-respecting, knowledgeable Jew would have understood, because it would have been allowed back then. Just want a fig, see a tree with fig on it, grab it. That was a perfectly fine thing to do. Any self-respecting Jew would have realized 'tis not the season for figs to be eating. And yet he goes to this tree, and it says he's hungry, and yet he doesn't find any figs, because it's not the season of figs. Now, the reality is, technically, there are some fig trees that you could have been eating from during then, but it would have been like grabbing, the greenest, most unripe apple you've ever had, the fig equivalent of that. Or because of the nature of the climate, it would have been a fig that had sort of been held over from the previous section. In either scenario, would not have tasted great, but I guess when you're really up against it, beggars can't be choosers. And so it is a bit of a problematic story, because you want to say, well, Jesus, it wouldn't have had fruit naturally. So why do you curse something that wouldn't have had fruit for not having fruit at that time? I don't quite know. But I do think there's been a lot of debate about what is meant by the word season. So it's not the season for the figs. And so, again, remember, and we talked about this last week on Sunday, and this is a little bit of out of order in Mark's gospel. In Mark 12, and Jesus is telling the story about the wicked tenants, he is referencing heavily Isaiah 5. And Isaiah 5 is the story of an unproductive vineyard in the Old Testament. It is the root, or one of the primary roots, of the imagery of Israel itself being a vineyard. And so this barren fig tree is like the unproductive vineyard, which comes to be associated with Israel's failure in the imagery of the prophets. And so people have actually argued that phrase there, which is specifically at the tail end of verse 13, for it was not the season for the figs, because that word season there is the one that Mark is also using the word for age, as in this is the age of the kingdom of heaven. What is actually happening there is Jesus is using eschatological imagery on purpose. So Jesus is almost like, sometimes if you've ever spoken with a therapist, or if you're ever, dealing with someone in authority, there's times where one will be willfully ignorant in order to make the larger point. If I saw my daughter do something, and then I went and asked her if she did it or not, well, I know she did it. I saw her did it, but I'm trying to be willfully ignorant in order to tease out the larger story. Maybe that's what's happening with Jesus here. But the point here, when it says it's not the season for figs, it's an eschatological point, meaning there's something happening. Times are changing, and Jesus is willing to use what he has at hand, even though the season is kind of strange, and maybe that's part of it. He knows it won't have figs on it. So he tells people, oh, I'm really hungry. I'm going to go have fig over there. And the disciples don't go, hey, what's wrong with this guy? He should know better. There's not a faith. We don't hear that discussion, but maybe that's what's going on there. So let's move on real quick. I don't want to spend a ton of time on that because obviously that has a stinger that comes after the cleansing of the temple. So who would read 15 through 19 for us?
On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, they went out of the city.
All right. So Mark and sandwich, we've gotten to the meat. Well, in that case, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the meat actually does explain the bun as well. And in this case, I think what is happening is both the cursing of the fig tree and the demonstration of the temple are themselves parables that are being acted out. Therefore, there is a bit of an absurdism or an extremism to them. They are living, walking parables, which has traditions in Israel's prophets. So here's how it works. Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for Jerusalem for 3 years as a demonstration as a prophet. Jeremiah hid a linen loincloth at the Euphrates until it was ruined. This is Jeremiah 13. And then broke an earthen jug as a sign of God's judgment. That's Jeremiah 19. Ezekiel dramatized the siege of Jerusalem. And perhaps probably the most obvious, worst, and problematic of this would be the prophet Hosea, who married a woman of ill repute named Gomer and named her children Jezreel, which means God sows, Lo-Ruhamah, which is not pitied, and Lo-Ami, not my people, and then took Gomer back after she continued to cheat on Hosea. All of this as a way to demonstrate what Israel was doing to God, continuing to cheat on God. So Jesus is stepping into that role of prophet to say, I'm going to act out parables. And so this, what is done with the fig tree, and now what is happening in the temple is a bit of that acting out. Now, so here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the sheer volume of animals that are going through this temple at the Passover. All right. So this might just change your conception of things that were happening. Get this. The quantity of animals and goods consumed by the offerings in the temple during the festival was staggering. And so Josephus records, and this is something from the Passover AD 66, worshipers required 255,600 lambs. Blood that was flowing from the altar was in such enormous amounts, they cut channels coming out of the altar to go to the corner of the temple, which would flow down into the Kidron Valley and would be collected down in the valley and sold to gardeners and farmers as fertilizer. That's how much blood was flowing out of here, that it created a river of blood flowing out of the altar, out of the temple, down the corner of the temple, which sits right on the edge of the Kidron Valley, down into the valley, so much that it could be collected and sold to farmers. 255,600 lambs. And that's just the lambs. That's the expensive stuff. Josephus. Yep. That's a lot of lambs. Animals had to be without blemish or broken bones. And if they were quadrupeds, they had to be male. So if they're 4 legs, got to be male. So every offering had to be accompanied by salt, which is interesting because salt had enormous worth, even though they were sitting right next to the Dead Sea. Salt still had enormous worth. We had talked about, I think, in previous weeks when Jesus is using that phrase, salt losing its saltiness, that an interesting imagery because salt from the Dead Sea wasn't necessarily as valuable because it had other minerals in it and it could lose its saltiness over time. anyways, it had to have salt coming with it. It also had to bring wine with it. Sorry, folks, if you like white wine, too bad. This only had to be red wine. You could only use red wine. And so there were 3 big pilgrimages every year: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, where there was an enormous demand for these animals. So I believe I've talked about this in a sermon before, but I want to rehash it here. If you were coming from the northern or southern or western part of the kingdom, and you were coming to Jerusalem to make an offering, and you were bringing a lamb, and that lamb had to be unblemished with no broken bones, you can understand why a market for lambs at the temple might pop up, because that's a long way to bring a lamb and hope that it made it the whole way without getting marked up, broken, eaten, whatever it was. And so it is, to some extent, a matter of convenience that these marketplaces in and around the temples would have popped up. Now, the temple, it's big, but it's not 255,000 lambs big. It's just not possible for one market to do this. And that is why other markets popped up. And there actually was a bit of sort of temple intrigue with these other markets. So we are aware of the high priest. We know his name around Jesus's time, Caiaphas. We know that because of the trial. We'll talk about him coming up. But there was also the Sanhedrin. And so there's the high priest, who is the person that manages the temple itself. But there is the Sanhedrin, which is the governing body of the religious institution. And so there was some degree of intrigue, because we have evidence that around the year 30 AD, the Sanhedrin left the temple as their meeting place and started meeting on the Mount of Olives itself. So we don't know why. Some people think there may have been a rift between Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Maybe it was just, hey guys, we're out of space. Or maybe it was as simple as, we really need to have some markets here. So some people have actually even theorized this cropping of the markets actually began happening around this time. And so in that 30 AD, which would have been, if we were trying to get real exact on the date Jesus would have gone to Jerusalem, 30 AD is a pretty good guess. Even though our Roman calendar is about 3 years off sometimes, that's a pretty good guess, 30 AD. So on the Mount of Olives, there started to develop 4 other markets, which were controlled by the sons of Hanan. And so the visitors could purchase doves or other goods that they would need. And this whole area, it was almost like the temple itself. For that period of time when they had these markets on the surrounding areas, the temple extended its holiness to those sort of areas. And so you'd have people from the priesthood and from the Sanhedrin would be patrolling and controlling these markets to make sure that even though they weren't in the temple courtyards, they would still operate by the same temple rules. Doves in particular were prescribed as offerings for the purification of women. And if you think about it, Luke records that Mary and Joseph offered a pair of turtle doves following Jesus's birth, which made sense in the context of Mary trying to restore her ritualistic cleanliness after giving birth, which would have been a process that would have made her ritualistically unclean. There was also money changers. Most people in ancient Israel would have been using Roman coins, because Rome was the controlling country, would have dominated the economy, and probably would have mandated it. But Jews could not pay the temple tax with Roman coins, because Roman coins had the picture of Caesar on it, who claimed to be God. And so you had to create a system by which people could convert Roman coins into acceptable Jewish coins. Shekels, they wouldn't have had their old Hebrew shekels. That would have been so out of date. So they actually had a thing called Tyrian shekels, which they used. And so there was a surcharge, money changers, because, it cost money to change money. And so they had it says the surcharge of half a silver muah, which was equal to 1/24th of a shekel, was added. So a pretty small percentage was being added there. Half a shekel was due from every male Israelite 20 years old or over. Women, minor, and slaves were exempted. So congratulations, you don't have to pay the temple tax. And the temple tax was due on the first month of Nisan each year, which was about 2 years before Passover. And it was so ritualistically important that if you got your money in late, that money, which was accepted, could not be used for the temple because it was considered ritualistically impure because it showed up late. That's how on the nose they were about this. So there's a part that's going to come up a little bit later when they have the argument, and they're saying they're challenging Jesus's authority. By what authority do you have to do any of these things? Someone has actually made the argument that the priest might actually be a little bit confused. So the chief priest there in the temple might actually have been a little confused. And what he might have been asking was, are you doing this on behalf of the Sanhedrin? Because if there was a political rift there between the chief priest and those who serve the chief priest and the Sanhedrin, and you had these competing markets or these markets here, and Jesus comes in and he rips up the market in the temple, but not the one on the Mount of Olives, he might have been asking, are you doing this on behalf of our religious political rivals, the Sanhedrin, and their markets over there on the Mount of Olives? I think that's an interesting thing. That's one person's interpretation. Another person's interpretation was it wasn't Jesus being angry that they were being sold. There was actually a symbolic action talking about the unnecessary nature of temple sacrifices moving forward in God's kingdom. So that's one big aspect of this. He's criticizing things. He's using those powerful words, a house of prayer for all nations. He's using den of robbers, and he's drawing really deep into Israel's prophetic tradition. That house of prayer for all nations is Jeremiah 7. And it's where Jeremiah is talking about the temple is a place where God intends people from all nations will be welcome. So it's the gospel, the kingdom of heaven is expanding. It's not just for Jews, it's for the whole world. And yet you and your gatekeeping are keeping it just for Jews. There's the use of that word den of robbers, which is really interesting because after 70 AD, how did they describe all the Jews that revolted and tried to keep control of the temple from Rome? They described them as robbers. The exact same word were there. And so that's that sort of things using multiple layers. They were probably robbing people in the sense that they weren't charging fair rates, that they were taking advantage of people traveling long distances. That certainly probably was true in these markets, but it's also functioning on that level of just kind of like what we said earlier about the Vespasian parade when it came to the triumphal entry. This text is working on, 2, 3, 4 levels with folks. So that's I don't know. I think that's an interesting point there. And then at the end of it, it says, and when the evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. This establishes what happens because cities in the ancient world, when the sun starts to go down, cities shut down because cities are in many ways the inverse of the Western industrial city. Western industrial cities, often working class or poor people, live near the center of the city because that's where the industry happens. But in the ancient world, in some ways, it's almost what our modern world is now reverting to, is where wealthy and elite are the ones that live in the core of the city. And so what happens is they tend to lock those gates of the ancient city as protection for the elite who live inside the city walls. The temple and the palace, they dominated the center of the city. They had fortifications around their own, but around them in the city lived elite populations which controlled the temple, which controlled coins, writing, taxation for the entire society. And so at the outer limits of the city is where the poorest people lived. Frequently in walled-off sections of the city in which occupational and ethnic groups lived together. So there might have been cloisters of other walled areas, but the main big walls of the city were there to protect the elite. And so when nighttime came, they shut those walls down so the poor couldn't interact with or endanger the elite. The people who lived all the way outside the furthest of city walls were beggars, prostitutes, persons of undesirable occupations like shepherds, traders who may be wealthy, but by nature of their job had to interact with folks, people who didn't have land and who just drifted towards the city as an act of working out day each day. So the idea that Jesus had to leave at night was just in fitting with the way a city operated then. He either needed to get out of the city or he was going to be locked in there for all night. So that's something that was happening there. So next morning, they're coming back by, and what do they see? They see something with a withered tree. Who would read that for us, 20 through 25? Okay.
In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses.
All right. Thank you. So that little turn of phrase, withered away to its roots, is sort of a commonly said ancient Jewish phrase. So that would have popped some people. That would have been saying a phrase that people were very familiar with. It's not really illuminating. It's just interesting. They're walking by. They see the fig tree that's cursed and withered. And then Jesus begins a discourse on faith. So the fig tree, as we talked about, is a symbol from Israel. That's something we get from Jeremiah, from Hosea, from Joel, from Micah, from Isaiah. And the description of a fig tree that is dying, or just like a vineyard dying, is symbolism that we get from Isaiah and Hosea as well. And so he uses this as a further discussion of faith. Remember, Mark is always pitting faith and fear against each other. Faith and gospel is this unswerving, unwavering confidence that the power of God is at work in Jesus, that a power that's able to heal and transform. And so I want to talk about some passages from Isaiah, but I think it's best, in order to do that, we should read them, because I think it sets up a really radical shift, and I think in the way we will understand Jesus's prayer here. Or his description of faith and prayer. So would someone be willing to turn to Isaiah 40 and read verses 3 through 5 for us? Isaiah 40, 3 through 5. Okay. Keep in mind the context. Jesus is encountering this fig tree, is on the Mount of Olives, which is a mount that is roughly the same height as the Temple Mount, with a small valley between them, where Gethsemane is. These are both areas of enormous messianic prediction. And so this is what's happening in Isaiah 40, 3 through 5.
A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all mankind together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
All right. So these are famous verses you've heard. You've heard them out of John the Baptist's mouth. Hold on to that mic. Yep. Yep. So yeah. Okay. Yep. Quoting Handel. That's funny. So this is one of those great Isaiah prophetic predictions, which was really originally made in reference to the Babylonian captivity and the return of Israel from captivity back, as they're imagining this enormous voyage from Babylon and from Persia all the way back to their homeland. Talking about making almost this super highway through the desert. Where mountains are brought low, valleys are raised up, it's flat, it's easy, the way there. And so that sets up not only the return, but it sets up the messianic prediction, because the Messiah was said to come from the east. Just as Israelites return from captivity from the east, so the Messiah comes from the east to the temple. And so wilderness is always associated with the east. If you were standing on the Temple Mount and looked out east from there, you would see the Mount of Olives. But beyond that, it would be wilderness of the mountains that eventually goes down to the Dead Sea. Then the mountains would rise up again. And beyond that would just be the enormous deserts that are beginning in Jordan, leading all the way to Babylon. And so Jesus is playing on that imagery as he's up there. So he's standing on a mountain, looking down a valley, cross at another mountain, and there's a passage rattling around in our heads about this mountain being lowered, this valley being raised, and the other mountain being lowered. Okay, so could you turn to Isaiah 45 and read verse 2? Verse 2, would you read that for us, Ron?
Yes. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron.
Okay, so again, this leveling of mountains, this moving of mountains. And so in the context now, we can place these messianic expectations of Jesus standing on a mountain, saying these things. And so let's look at what he says here when he starts talking about faith. Have faith in God. He says at the end of 22, into 23, truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown in the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. So when Jesus says, truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, he's talking about an actual mountain. So the way we use these phrases often, right, we just think Jesus is talking about that mountain right there. You know, the one we can see, the hill out here, or any conceptual mountain we can think of. And yet we miss the context Jesus is saying all of this in. He is quite literally saying this mountain. Now, you can interpret that out and just say, okay, well, we can take that to mean something larger within our spiritual context, but within the context he's saying there, he is very much predicting this radical shift in the way religion operates. Because if the mountain is brought low, if that mountain is destroyed and brought low, or if that mountain was thrown into the ocean and he's looking across at a mountain, what's on that mountain? The temple. So in many ways, he's saying something quite provocative. So, I mean, now something he's certainly predicted before. He's certainly predicted these things before, but it cannot be missed. There's also a tradition within Judaism that the Messiah would break away these mountains from each other, that the mountains between the two would be ripped apart. There's all these traditions he's playing with here. And so I don't necessarily know if that radically changes our understanding of the text, but it does give a little more context of what Jesus is playing with here, what's on his palette that he's painting with. Standing on a mountain, looking across at another mountain that contains the temple, telling people if they have faith that that mountain can be taken up and thrown into the sea. But he's using these things all as a way to say, with your faith in me, all these things are possible. Not that you would do them, not that you will take up this mountain, but that your faith will allow God to do these things. Now, keep in mind, what are some of the things where can you remember some stories earlier in the gospel where Jesus talks about the power of faith and how it heals?
An individual who's having
Okay, your faith has made you well. Who's he say that to? Mm-hmm. Yep. Does it again in a couple other areas. Yeah, it's a theme that comes up with Mark over and over. This profound faith enables miraculous things, and it's the faith that enables them to do that. So faith is so transformational, it heals. Faith is so transformational that it creates a better pathway to God by bringing down mountains and raising up valleys, preparing a way through the desert. That's this powerful imagery Jesus is talking about when he pits faith versus fear. It's an unwavering faith in Jesus's power to be the Messiah. It's an unwavering faith in Jesus's power to raise the valleys and lower the mountains, to straighten our path to God. So I don't know. I think that's interesting. So I hope that's helpful. Another thing to think about too is there was a practice, we're probably more familiar with this in modern Islam, where during their prayer times, they are going to face Mecca. But it was a practice within ancient Judaism to pray towards the temple. There was all those rituals associated with that. And yet, if you notice when Jesus is talking about prayer, he says it's not determined on your posture of how you prayed, which direction you faced in. The efficacy of your prayer is built on faith, not by all of the other ritualistic actions, which is another way of Jesus, in many ways, upending the expectations of the temple. Yep.
One more thing on the whole issue of faith. I don't think this was from Mark, but it was a couple months ago when I was reading it. It was the one of the stories where the disciples were trying to cast out a demon and they couldn't do it. And at least in the translation I was reading, when Jesus came and they were asking him, why couldn't we do this? His response, oh, this faithless generation, how much longer must I stay with you? And for some reason, it just, however many times I've read that, it kind of bothered me that it wasn't, oh, you sinful generation.
Faithless. Oh, here's gonna blow your mind too. What's he say after that about that demon? What's it take to get that demon?
Yeah.
Only these come out with prayer. Yep, Mark, and that's Mark. So you are referencing Mark, yeah, and that's yeah, faith and prayer. Mark is linking those two in a radical way. The power of prayer and faith. Yep. All right, let's keep moving. We're picking up speed here. So, anybody notice anything strange about their Bible at this point? So we just read. We just read through verse 25, and then the next section picks up. Anything strange there? Jesus talks about this. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. That's verse 25. And then we pick up here again. It says in verse 27, again, they came to Jerusalem. We're missing a verse. We're missing Mark 11, verses 26. Now, this isn't the first time. We've noticed this before a couple of weeks ago where the verse is missing, and it has to do with ancient sources. Now, if you have a King James, you may have a verse 26. Some have them. Here's the King James verse 26. It's not that shocking. But if ye do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. So verse 25, there's lots of debates about this. This isn't a terribly consequential one because these verses, verse 25 certainly implies verse 26. But these things happen because of disagreement between ancient sources. Our most ancient sources don't have verse 26. This one's a little bit different. This one's a little muddier than some of the others. And the theory for why verse 26 was accidentally omitted is pretty strong. There's a very technical term that I cannot remember at this moment, but basically means scribal errors often happen when sentences end with the same words. So the end of verse 25, your trespasses, or forgive your trespasses, is the exact same series of Greek words that end verse 26. And so the theory for some people is the reason verse 26 is omitted in some documents is as a result of a scribal error, because the scribe, as they were copying, you think about it, your entire life is just sit there and do this, thought they had written verse 26 because they saw the end of those words. And so accidentally omitted them. That's one. No, it wasn't numbered. They just thought well, I should say sentence. They thought they had already written that sentence because the sentence ends the same way, and then just moved on. So that's one theory. We don't have numbers until like the 1600s or later. So it's a matter of sentences. And again, when you're also writing just an absolute ginormous stream of letters because there's no spaces between words. And in most manuscripts, they're all capital letters. You just, everything's yelling. Yep, exactly. So again, but this isn't a consequential one. It's just an interesting thing to note. It depends on where you use your what you view as the authoritative original text. And the King James uses a different authoritative original text that most scholars would argue, and I agree, is outdated because we have much older manuscripts now that correct a lot of errors in the King James. But most of the differences aren't so significant that it renders one as being completely right and the other completely wrong. So if you're reading the King James, you're still reading the Bible. You're just using a Bible that uses different Greek words.
This thing has to be taken sort of like that.
Yes, it does.
Although you could very often, you could ask for a Cadillac, get your Cadillac, well, maybe it won't happen, but then again, that really God's will.
Mhm.
And to me, that qualifier has to be in here, sort of, maybe it's implicit. I'm just being silly, but
Yeah.
But you can see someone taking this out of context and saying, prosperity gospel, you can have whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Especially too, you have to live in it also with, like, Jesus is using metaphorical language here. Like, is he the mountain wasn't literally torn down. I mean, the temple was destroyed, but, like, I'm sorry, you could go there now, and many of the bricks that Herod put there are still there. The tip of Mount Moriah is still there. The Mount of Olives is still there. These weren't so. Even Jesus' own example, which has some degree of metaphorical truth to it, and the destruction of the temple and the changing of the religion, is not literally true. And I think your point about the health and wealth gospel, of the misappropriation of a text like this for that, and along with many other Old Testament passages, points to how careful you have to be in reading scripture. The famous example is the awful overuse of the Philippian, or Ephesians, what is it? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's like, he's not talking about you scoring a touchdown. It's like, that's not what this is about, and yet it's our ability to, because we have verse numbers, pull something out of context and use it as an inspirational quote. It really robs the richness of the faith out of certain things. And I think, this is a prime example of one of those passages. Faith, you gotta have faith that moves mountains. And it's like, let's temper that a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And by all means, pray for those things. By all means, pray for, I can tell you my own ethics of this, of like, when I pray for folks, when I pray in emergency situations, when I pray in the life situations, by all means, pray for miracles if one is so inclined. I tend to pray for best possible outcomes, because I think, in my experience with God, I think that's how, that's how those things work. I, I don't know. I think there are some people who, we talk about the different gifts. I think some people have, a gift of faith that can, I don't mean to say these words in a disparaging way, sort of blindly pray for miracles, expect them, and when they don't happen, not be disappointed. I think there are people that have that type of faith, but I don't think everyone has that type of faith. And so we have to, ultimately, any act of faith and prayer is a surrender to, ultimately, your will be done. Your will be done. And so I to that extent, if we pray for someone with a difficult cancer diagnosis facing surgery, when we pray, for me, I pray for, the surgeon to do the best possible job, those caring to the best that God empowers us to use our minds to treat and work, that all those things, frankly, and this in a medical system, miraculously work together to produce best possible outcomes. But that, I don't see that prayer as being exclusionary of prayers for miracles, because I just think you kind of have to know the way your faith, because I think you can pray in that first scenario for best possible outcomes, and it be an absolute prayer of your will be done. And if your will happens to be a miraculous healing, God bless. But if your will just happens to be, through these things working together, we steal an additional great 6 months, amen. And if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful. That's a really confusing area and complicated area.
Usually if you begin by a faith relationship, faith is strong enough to recognize other faith.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. I fully agree with that. I think what you were saying there in that second half, I fully agree with. Is there a question I missed from that, or is that just? Yeah, I think that's a pretty wise way of saying that. Yeah, yeah. I think the complicating factor is this is at the same time we also follow a savior who tells us a parable about a woman who nags a corrupt judge enough to get justice for herself. So there at the same time we serve a Messiah who um, once called a Syrophoenician woman a dog, and then she cleverly retorted back to him, well, even dogs get the crumbs from the table. And it seemingly changes as Jesus's orientation of grace towards some Gentiles. So it's not it's a surrender, but a surrender isn't always the same thing as acquiesce. There's still a two-way street, but ultimately it's a surrender. I don't know. It's almost like I don't know. It's almost like a husband and wife making a covenant about saying, "Honey, we're going to fight. We're going to fight this out. We're going to get in an argument, but we're resolving at the end. We're still going to stay in relationship with each other." Maybe that's a healthy metaphor to talk about it. Or, I'm going to get in a fight with God. I'm going to be angry with God, just like the Psalms are full of lament. But at the end, I still affirm that God is God and I am not. And if the only thing I have left in my life, if I am so poor in spirit, the only thing I can do is trust God, well, Jesus says I'm blessed. So I don't know. All right, let's finish it out. I'll read the last section here, 27 through 33. Again, they came to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. What should we say? If we say from heaven, he will say, "Why then did you not believe him?" But shall we say of human origin? They were afraid of the crowd, and for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority am I doing these things." The first thing I want you to notice is, and this will become extremely relevant over the next couple weeks. Jesus has come to Jerusalem. He has already been to the temple 2 times before. Okay, so did you notice that? Jesus came first day, triumphal entry, went home. Next day, comes back, curses the fig tree, clears the temple, goes home. Next day, comes by, they see the fig tree is withered down to the root. He ultimately gives them some teaching about the kingdom of heaven, and about forgiveness and prayer and faith. And then they head to Jerusalem, and he walks in the temple and begins this series of arguments. It's almost like, I don't know, he second he gets in, they're waiting for him. I think somebody actually made the argument that it stands to reason that Jesus, with the incident that happened the day before, provoked such an enormous hubbub that they were there waiting because they needed to investigate this. And the context I said earlier, that maybe they were asking, are you siding with those Sanhedrin guys that are now meeting up on the hill instead of the temple? That could be some context. But so this is the third time. And this is it. And so from here all the way into 13 is one scene. So the series of arguments that Jesus has. This one goes immediately into the one we talked about on Sunday, where he tells the parable of the wicked tenants. And then on this Sunday, where he gets a question from a scribe who's not trying to trick him about what's the greatest commandment. And then goes on and he sees the widow giving the money and all the other predictions in between those. This is all the same day. I think that's significant because it's easy for us to chop those things up. Just think about if you've ever studied the Sermon on the Mount. It's sometimes it's hard to remember. This was one big sermon. So I think that's important to understand. So he goes in, they ask him the most important question, what authority do you do these things? That's a really big question back then because authority stems from who gives it to you. So for example, the chief priest, he knows where he gets his authority. He is able to control the commerce and the function of the temple because the Roman leader of the area, in that case Pilate, would have given him the authority to do that. So authority flows down from the people who give it to you. It is both a religious and political question, and they're asking him that question. It could be they're asking me, are you doing this on behalf of the Sanhedrin? And then they could get into a whole argument about that. But Jesus does the good Jewish rabbinical thing and answers a question with a question. And he answers them with a really good question that he puts a little caveat on it. He's like, if you answer my question, I'll answer yours. But if you don't, I won't give you an answer to your question. So he answered the challenging question about John's baptism. They have their little side huddle. And if you notice, they come out and they don't even share their true feelings. They have a discussion, but the discussion, it seems at some level that maybe they agree with John, but we don't know entirely. But they're engaging the question just what's going to work for them, because they realize at this point Jesus has them rhetorically trapped. And they come back and in their answer, they can't even be honest. They just say, we don't know, because they worry about the political manifestations of those things. Let's see. Yeah.
Likelihood that would not be in the holy place.
Yeah. So we talked about that. It's on the mount. It's on. Yes, but as a matter of function, they understood, and the Sanhedrin and folks oversaw the temple, so they would have understood that like it had some degree of holiness to it. Now, it wasn't in the temple courts, but I can't tell you if someone thought like, I can't tell you if there was really a culture of, well, you bought your goat on the Mount of Olives, and I bought one of mine at the temple. Yours isn't as good as mine. Or if someone says, I'm only buying a goat for them, I can't tell that because again, it's like ancient Judaism isn't really about what do you feel in your heart or what's the purest motive in your heart. It's about, did you conform to the expectations of the community? And so from that perspective, if the temple has set up a system by which a goat that you buy out in the Mount of Olives is ritualistically pure and you could bring it into sacrifice and you have a short distance to bring it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's pure. You brought it there. You fulfilled your obligation. You are pure and have honor within the community. So I don't think a lot of the things we would concern about as being one slightly better than the other really matters, because you're either ritualistically pure or not. And they bought it from a place that was pure and holy, would have been good enough. So this is a contest of wits between Jesus. This gets back a little bit to this gets all the way back to, the earliest confrontations with Jesus. The first question they were asking Jesus, if you think about it, all the way back in Mark 1, when Mark says that Jesus taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. There's this constant question around Jesus on whose authority are you doing this? This isn't the first time they've asked this. They've asked this all the way back in Galilee when he was raising a stink and when he was healing people. On whose authority are you healing? On whose authority are you teaching? And yet Mark is also telling us that Jesus is speaking as one with authority. So this is a really, really big question. And so when someone asks you a question in this environment, as we talked about before, in this honor and shame culture, you either respond and win the argument, respond and lose the argument, and therefore you lose honor. Or if you don't respond at all, you lose honor. And so there's some degree that this story is also telling us that the fact that the Pharisees couldn't answer Jesus, and because they couldn't answer Jesus, Jesus felt no reason to give them his answer. Jesus clearly won this argument in the eyes of everyone watching this. Did you catch that? We do not know. And Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. I don't owe you an answer. My honor is such, I don't owe you shameful people an answer. So it's pretty dramatic there.
You come by the word because of genealogy, because of study under.
Mhm. It's probably all the above. Yep. Yep. None of that. Exactly. You can understand from the perspective you just laid out why Jesus as a figure is so offensive. He's from Galilee. He's not attended rabbinical school. He's not within a family. He's not within the right tribe. He's not around the temple. He has none of those things. And yet he walks into all of their environments and he uses his authority in those environments to argue on behalf of the poor, argue on behalf of the marginalized, argue on behalf of Gentiles. And he goes into all your environments and messes them up and says, you think it's this, the kingdom is wider than this.
In many ways, he's another nature.
That's a good example. Yeah.
Went through five listed how many times God used the building.
Yep.
And it's unbelievable.
It's everybody.
It's not the exception.
And even though each gospel tells slightly different stories, so some people make the argument that Mark is more of an adoptionist theology, that Jesus was someone that was adopted into as God's son. People have made that argument. I'm just comparing and then you get on the other end, John, which is the latest one, which probably has the highest Christology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then you get to, you look at Matthew. Matthew begins all these things with obviously birth narratives, but also genealogy. Matthew's genealogy, even though these are different gospels written for different traditions, Matthew, who probably of all the gospels should be the one that is most concerned with status and being somebody from somewhere, keeps the thread of Jesus being connected with David. But Matthew swerves completely out of his way multiple times to point out people within Jesus's lineage that are women and are people of ill repute and foreigners. And it's interesting of just like nobody from nowhere, from Nazareth, of a tecton, a worker, and yet he's the one that has the guts to walk in the temple, to teach with authority and to say that the kingdom of heaven is greater and that you don't need the temple. You don't need to pray to the temple. You don't need these sacrificial systems. God is concerned about what's in your heart and how you relate to your neighbor. Can anything good come from that? Yeah. And all is this to say is what Jesus is arguing here is not radically out of step with some schools of rabbinical teaching of that day. The Hillel school of thought is Jesus is very much a prophetic, apocalyptic rabbi of that day. So it's not like Jesus alone was a theological wrecking ball, because he is everything he's saying in many cases, like we were talking about divorce in a couple weeks. When he's talking about fulfilling the law, if every time Jesus seems to have a question specifically about the law, he seems to intensify it, because Jewish law had very set rules of how you could divorce someone. And yet Jesus intensifies it and talks about matters of the heart. And so he's very much he's not stepping out of tradition. He is within the tradition. And he does have parallels of other teachers of the day. He's the one that relies in prominence, and he's the one the movement is around, and he's the one that is viewed as Messiah and God's son. And so he does come out of nowhere in a way, but he also is firmly within his own tradition. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. Great discussion. We want to talk. We can certainly after this, but I wanted to keep this in as short as possible. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week. Take care.
You got a good work.